The tractor coughed once, lurched forward 3 feet, then died in the middle of the auction yard while half the town laughed. A sharp burst of black smoke rolled into the dry Kansas wind, and somewhere behind the crowd, a man muttered, "Guess that old rust bucket finally gave up." A few people chuckled louder than they should have. Boots scraped gravel. Someone cracked open a beer, even though it was barely noon. The August sun hung low and white over the wheat fields beyond the fence line, baking the dirt lot until heat shimmered above the rows of farm equipment waiting to be sold off piece by piece. The woman standing beside the dead tractor did not laugh. She tightened her grip on the brim of her weathered tan hat and looked down at the steering wheel like she was trying not to let anyone see disappointment settle across her face. Mud streaked the hem of her jeans. Dust clung to her boots. Nothing about her looked rich. Nothing about her asked for attention, which was probably why nobody noticed the silence in her eyes. "You buying it or burying it, Eleanor?" One of the men called out from near the livestock gate. More laughter followed. She gave a small nod like she had heard worse before. Then she stepped down from the tractor without a word. At the edge of the crowd, Ethan Brooks glanced toward his daughter and checked the time on his cracked phone screen. "Dad," Clara whispered softly beside him, tugging on the sleeve of his faded denim jacket. "If we leave now, we can still make the recital." Ethan looked toward the highway, then back at the stalled tractor sitting alone under the brutal afternoon light. The auctioneer was already moving on, talking louder now, trying to pull attention toward a newer combine parked farther down the row. Most people had lost interest. That should have been the end of it. But Ethan kept staring at the tractor, at the loose vibrations still rattling beneath the hood, at the woman pretending not to care while the town quietly embarrassed her in front of everyone. Clara noticed the look in his eyes before he even moved. "Dad," she said carefully. Ethan exhaled once through his nose. 5 minutes. You always say 5 minutes. I know. He handed her the paper bag holding 2 gas station sandwiches and started walking toward the tractor. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. Dry wind pushed against his jacket. Somewhere nearby, a country song played weakly through blown speakers attached to the auction tent, the sound drifting in and out like an old memory. Ethan stopped beside the tractor and crouched near the engine housing. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked quietly. The woman blinked once, surprised more by his tone than the offer itself. "You know tractors?" Enough to know when somebody's about to get cheated at an auction. That earned the faintest flicker of amusement from her. Barely there, but real. Behind them, another man snorted. "Save your time, Brooks. That thing's junk." Ethan ignored him. He removed his cap, wiped sweat from his forehead, and leaned deeper beneath the hood. Grease stained his fingers almost immediately. The engine ticked softly in the heat. He listened instead of rushing. Listened the way men do when machines have become the only honest conversations left in their lives. The woman watched him for a moment. "You work local?" she asked. "Repair jobs mostly." "Mostly." Ethan tightened a loose line with careful hands. "Mostly whatever keeps the lights on." Clara slowly wandered closer now, clutching her recital shoes against her chest. She looked at the woman politely. "Hi." The woman softened immediately at the sight of her. "Hi there. My dad fixes everything," Clara said with quiet confidence. Ethan glanced back. "That is absolutely not true." "Well, most things." The woman looked at Ethan again, studying him differently now. Not because of the worn jacket or the tired eyes or the dust covering his boots, but because his daughter believed in him completely, and somehow that still existed in a world where most people stopped believing in anything years ago. Ethan reached deeper into the engine, adjusted the fuel linkage, then nodded once to himself. "Try it now." "That's simple," she asked. Usually the expensive problems start simple. She climbed back onto the tractor seat. The engine turned once, twice, then roared alive with a deep metallic rumble that echoed across the lot. Conversation stopped. A few heads turned back around. Even the auctioneer paused mid-sentence. Ethan stepped away from the smoke, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. The woman stared at him from the tractor seat like she was trying to understand something she had not expected to find there. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. Ethan shook his head immediately. "Nothing. You fixed it. Took 6 minutes. Still." He shrugged lightly. "Looks like you need the tractor more than I need the money." For a second, she did not answer. Wind rolled across the open fields beyond the fence line, bending the tall wheat in slow golden waves under the afternoon sun. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low across the plains. A storm was coming. Clara tugged Ethan's sleeve again. "Dad, the recital." Ethan looked toward the highway one more time, then back at the woman. She climbed down slowly from the tractor, boots landing softly in the dust. "Eleanor Vale," she said at last, offering her hand. Ethan hesitated before shaking it. Her grip was steady, warm from the heat. "Ethan Brooks." She glanced toward Clara. "You two heading somewhere important?" Clara nodded quickly. "Piano recital." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then you should not let an old tractor make you late." Ethan tipped his cap once, simple and respectful, then turned to leave with Clara beside him. But as they walked toward his pickup truck, neither of them noticed the older banker standing near the auction tent suddenly straighten at the mention of Eleanor's last name, or the way two men near the livestock gate stopped talking altogether, or how the auctioneer quietly removed his hat as Eleanor climbed back onto the tractor and drove it toward the western fields beyond town. Clara climbed into the truck and buckled herself in. "She seemed nice," she said softly. Ethan started the engine. "Yeah." Thunder rolled again, deeper this time. Across the horizon, dark clouds gathered over miles and miles of farmland stretching farther than the eye could see. And somewhere out there, without Ethan Brooks knowing it yet, almost every acre belonged to her. Before we continue, tell me something down in the comments. What time is it where you are watching from tonight? And what part of the world are you in? And if stories about quiet strength, second chances, and good people finding light again mean something to you, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next chapter. Because Ethan Brooks had no idea that 6 minutes beside a broken tractor had just placed him directly in the path of a woman carrying secrets far bigger than this town could hold. By the time Ethan and Clara reached the church auditorium on the east side of town, the storm clouds had swallowed most of the afternoon light. The old pickup rattled into the gravel parking lot beneath a row of cottonwood trees bending in the wind, their leaves flashing silver green before the rain. Ethan killed the engine and sat there a second longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. The smell of grease still clung to his fingers. Clara carefully balanced her recital shoes in her lap. "We made it," she whispered like she was afraid saying it too loud might ruin it. Ethan looked over at her and smiled faintly. "Told you. You also said 5 minutes. And I was almost right." She laughed softly under her breath and pushed open the truck door before the rain started. Inside the small auditorium, everything smelled like old wood, coffee, and floor polish. Parents filled the folding chairs near the stage while children in pressed shirts and pastel dresses waited nervously along the side curtains clutching sheet music. Ethan stayed near the back wall beside the coat rack, still wearing his dusty boots and faded denim jacket, while everyone else looked cleaner somehow, more put together. He never noticed those things until moments like this. Clara slipped her hand into his before walking toward the stage entrance. "Do I look okay?" she asked quietly. Ethan crouched slightly in front of her, adjusting one loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Kiddo, you look like your mom right before she used to play." Clara's eyes softened at that. "Not sad exactly. Just careful." She nodded once and disappeared behind the curtain. Ethan watched the empty stage for a long moment afterward. The piano sitting beneath the overhead lights looked almost too polished for this town. Too polished for people still worrying about cattle prices and overdue loans, and whether the rain would come early enough this year. Someone beside him cleared their throat. "Did not expect to see you at one of these." Ethan turned. Roy Mercer stood there holding 2 foam cups of coffee. Local feed supplier. Thick gray mustache. Kind eyes hidden behind years of sunburn and hard winters. Roy handed him a cup. "You missed the auction after that tractor mess." Ethan accepted the coffee carefully. Did not figure anybody noticed. Roy snorted softly. "Town notices everything." Ethan took a sip. It tasted burnt. "Familiar. You know that woman?" Roy asked after a moment. Ethan leaned back against the wall. "Not really." Roy stared toward the rain tapping lightly against the church windows now. "Funny thing about this county. Some people own land. Some people belong to it." Ethan frowned slightly. What is that supposed to mean? But Roy only shook his head. "Forget it." Before Ethan could ask more, the lights dimmed slightly over the audience, and the recital began. One by one, children walked onto the stage beneath warm yellow lighting, playing hesitant scales and nervous little melodies while proud parents clapped too loudly after every song. Ethan barely noticed any of them. His eyes stayed fixed on the side curtain waiting for Clara. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the plains. Then finally she stepped onto the stage. Small, composed, pale blue dress. Her hands trembled just a little as she sat at the piano bench. Ethan straightened without realizing it. Clara looked out toward the audience once, searching the room until she found him standing near the back wall. Ethan gave her one small nod. That was enough. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first few notes came quietly, almost fragile beneath the hum of rain outside. But then something settled inside her. The melody grew warmer, fuller. The room softened around it. Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. Not because Clara played perfectly. She missed. 2 notes near the middle. 1 pedal shift squeaked awkwardly. But she played honestly, like someone learning how to carry sadness gently instead of letting it drown her. It reminded him too much of his wife. The way she used to hum while washing dishes late at night. The way music lingered in their old farmhouse long after the lights went out. Ethan lowered his eyes for a second. Just breathing. Just listening. And that was when the back door of the auditorium quietly opened. Wind swept a ribbon of rain inside before someone slipped through and shut it again. Ethan looked up automatically. Eleanor Vale stood near the entrance, damp from the storm, her tan jacket darkened by rainwater around the shoulders. She had clearly driven fast to beat the weather and failed. For a second, she looked almost uncertain being there at all. Then Clara hit the final notes of the song, and Eleanor's attention moved fully to the stage. The applause began softly across the room. Clara stood, smiling nervously, bowing once before hurrying off stage. Ethan caught sight of Eleanor clapping too. Not politely, genuinely. Their eyes met briefly across the auditorium. Neither of them waved. Neither smiled much. But something shifted there anyway. Something quieter than attraction and harder to explain. Eleanor nodded once toward the stage as Ethan walked past her toward Clara backstage. She is good, she said softly. Ethan stopped beside her. Rain streaked slowly down the church windows behind them. Yeah, he answered after a moment. She gets that from her mother. Eleanor looked at him carefully then, like she had almost asked another question but decided against it. Clara suddenly appeared running down the hallway, still glowing from adrenaline. Dad, did you hear the ending part? I finally got it right. Then she noticed Eleanor standing there and blinked in surprise. Oh. Eleanor crouched slightly to Clara's level. You played beautifully. Clara smiled instantly. Children always knew sincerity before adults did. Thank you. Eleanor glanced back at Ethan. I should go before the roads flood. Ethan nodded once. Drive safe. She started toward the exit, then paused near the doors. As thunder cracked louder overhead, without turning around, she asked quietly, You still doing repair work tomorrow? Ethan frowned slightly. Depends what breaks. The faintest smile touched her voice. Something usually does. Then she stepped back into the rain and disappeared beyond the blurred glass doors, leaving Ethan standing there beneath the warm church lights with the strange feeling that the storm outside had somehow just begun. The storm stayed over Hollow Creek through most of the night, rolling low across the plains like something restless that could not settle. Rain hammered the tin roof of Ethan Brooks's farmhouse until nearly dawn, dripping steadily from the gutters into rusted buckets below the porch. By morning the world smelled washed clean. Wet soil, diesel, fresh cut hay somewhere down the county road. Ethan stood beneath the open garage awning with a wrench in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, while Clara sat cross-legged near the doorway, finishing homework before school. The old radio on the shelf crackled softly through static and weather reports. Flash flood warning remains in effect for portions of western Kansas. Clara looked up from her notebook. You think Miss Vale got home okay? Ethan tightened a bolt beneath the hood of a battered feed truck before answering. Probably. Probably means no. Ethan glanced at her. You ask a lot of questions before 8 in the morning. You avoid them before 8 in the morning. That almost made him smile. Almost. Before he could answer, headlights swept across the muddy driveway outside. Ethan straightened slowly as a dusty pickup rolled to a stop near the fence line. Eleanor stepped out wearing the same tan jacket from the recital, though now streaked with dried rain and mud along the sleeves. She looked like she had been driving back roads since sunrise. Clara noticed first. Told you, she whispered proudly. Ethan set down the wrench and walked toward the edge of the awning while Eleanor approached through the damp gravel. Wind moved softly through the wheat fields surrounding the property, carrying the faint metallic scent of another storm still somewhere far off. Morning, she said. Morning. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Clara sitting in the garage doorway. How was school? Clara blinked. It starts in 30 minutes. Right. Eleanor gave a quiet nod like she had forgotten children lived on schedules adults could not bend. Ethan crossed his arms lightly. Something break. Generator at one of the north fields. Bad. Depends how attached you are to electricity. Ethan stared at her a second. You always answer questions like that? Only before coffee. Clara hid a smile behind her notebook. Ethan finally reached for his tool bag near the garage wall. How far? About 20 miles west. That road flooded last night. I know. And you still drove out there? Eleanor looked past him toward the horizon instead of answering directly. Crops do not wait for weather. Something in her voice carried more weight than the sentence itself. Ethan noticed it. So did Clara. But neither pressed. 40 minutes later, after dropping Clara at school with a promise to pick her up before sunset, Ethan followed Eleanor's pickup down a narrow county road stretching deep into farmland most people in Hollow Creek never bothered driving through. Puddles reflected gray clouds overhead. Fence posts leaned crooked beside miles of wheat bending softly in the wind. Eleanor drove carefully but fast enough to suggest she knew every inch of these roads by memory. Ethan watched her through his windshield more than once. Something about her still did not fit. Women managing small leased farmland usually talked constantly about debt, weather insurance, equipment costs. Eleanor rarely talked at all unless it mattered. And when she did, people listened. They had arrived at an isolated equipment barn by late morning. The structure sat alone beside acres upon acres of rolling wheat fields stretching so far Ethan could barely see the fencing near the horizon. Eleanor stepped out first. Generator is inside. Ethan grabbed his bag and followed her through the wide barn doors. The interior smelled like machine oil and cedar dust. Old tools lined the walls with impossible neatness. Too organized for hired field workers. Ethan crouched beside the dead generator while Eleanor leaned quietly against a nearby workbench watching him inspect the damage. Fuel line froze moisture overnight, he muttered. Should not take long. Silence settled comfortably after that. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the roof edges into puddles below. Somewhere farther out in the fields, a windmill creaked rhythmically against the breeze. Eleanor folded her arms lightly. You always work alone? Ethan loosened the panel slowly. Mostly. That by choice. Sometimes. She nodded like she understood more than he intended to say. Ethan glanced toward her. You? What about me? You got all this land out here, and nobody helping? Eleanor's expression shifted almost invisibly. There are people. That was not really an answer. A faint smile touched one corner of her mouth before disappearing again. No, she admitted quietly. It was not. Ethan returned to the generator, but his curiosity stayed awake now, especially after noticing the framed black and white photograph sitting on a shelf nearby. A much younger Eleanor stood beside an older man in a suit outside what looked less like a farm and more like a corporate ribbon-cutting ceremony. Ethan frowned slightly. Eleanor noticed immediately. Without rushing, she crossed the barn and turned the frame face down before he could study it longer. Old family stuff, she said. Ethan looked at her for a beat too long. Right. The generator sputtered alive a few minutes later, rumbling low through the barn floor. Eleanor exhaled softly in relief. You keep saving my equipment. Ethan wiped grease from his hands. You keep driving broken equipment. Maybe I trust the mechanic. The sentence landed between them more quietly than flirting, and somehow more dangerous because of it. Ethan looked away first. Outside the barn, thunder rolled low again across the distant plains even though sunlight had begun breaking through the clouds in narrow golden streaks. Eleanor walked to the open doorway and stared out over the endless wheat fields moving like waves beneath the wind. Ethan stepped beside her after a moment. You own all this? He asked casually, more teasing than serious. For the first time since meeting her, Eleanor hesitated too long before answering. Enough of it. Then, somewhere down the road behind them, a black luxury SUV appeared through the drifting dust and started heading directly toward the barn. The black SUV rolled slowly through the mud toward the barn, its polished surface catching strips of pale sunlight breaking through the storm clouds overhead. It looked completely out of place against the wheat fields and rusted fencing, like someone had dropped a piece of downtown Chicago into the middle of western Kansas. Ethan watched it approach while Eleanor remained still beside the open barn doors, one hand resting lightly against the wood frame. She did not look surprised. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was the way her shoulders subtly stiffened before the vehicle even stopped. The engine quieted. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out holding an umbrella he never opened. Mid-50s. Silver hair. Expensive shoes already gathering dust from the road. He looked at Eleanor first, not Ethan. "There you are," he said calmly. Eleanor folded her arms. "You tracked my truck? You stopped answering calls." "That was intentional." The man sighed softly, then glanced toward Ethan with polite curiosity. "I did not realize you had company." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag slowly. "Just fixing a generator." "Of course." The man offered a restrained nod. "Walter Grayson." Ethan shook his hand briefly. The grip felt practiced. "Corporate. Not farm country." "Ethan Brooks." Walter repeated the name once under his breath, like he was storing it somewhere. Then his attention returned to Eleanor. The board meeting was moved to Friday. "I am not coming back to Denver yet. You may not have a choice." Eleanor's jaw tightened slightly. Wind swept through the barn, carrying the scent of rain-soaked wheat and diesel fuel. Ethan pretended to organize his tools while the silence between them sharpened. Walter lowered his voice, but not enough. "Investors are getting nervous." "Then let them." "Eleanor." I said no. The man paused. For a moment something almost human cracked through his polished expression. "Fatigue, maybe. Concern. Your father built too much to let it drift like this." At the mention of her father, Eleanor looked away toward the fields. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The silence afterward felt heavier than the argument itself. Walter exhaled once and adjusted his cuffs. "At least review the documents." He pulled a thick envelope from inside the SUV and set it carefully on a nearby crate. Eleanor did not touch it. "I will think about it." Walter studied her a second longer before nodding reluctantly. "Fine." Then his eyes moved back toward Ethan again. "Mr. Brooks." "Sir. Thank you for helping her out here." Ethan glanced toward Eleanor before answering. "Just doing repair work." Walter almost smiled at that, though not fully. Sometimes that matters more than people realize. Then he climbed back into the SUV, and a moment later the vehicle disappeared down the muddy road, leaving only drifting dust and the distant hum of tires fading across the plains. Silence settled over the barn again. The generator rumbled steadily behind them. Somewhere farther out, crows lifted from the wheat fields in dark, scattered bursts against the gray sky. Ethan finally looked toward the unopened envelope sitting on the crate. "Denver." Eleanor leaned against the barn doorway again, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I used to spend time there." "Used to. Now I spend time here." Ethan nodded slowly, though the answer explained nothing. He should have let it go. Probably would have, too, if he had not caught the faint gold lettering stamped across the corner of the envelope. Vale Agricultural Holdings. The name meant something. Not fully. Just enough to tug at memory. Grain silos maybe. National shipping contracts. News headlines he barely paid attention to while waiting in line at gas stations. Ethan frowned faintly. Eleanor noticed. "You ever get tired of asking questions without actually asking them?" she said quietly. Ethan gave a dry half laugh. "You ever answer one directly?" The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "Fair point." They stood beside each other without speaking after that. Wind rolled through the fields in long, whispering waves, bending the wheat beneath shifting sunlight. The storm had mostly passed now, leaving the world washed silver and gold beneath the clouds. Ethan realized he had not felt this calm beside another adult in a very long time. That realization unsettled him more than the SUV had. Eleanor finally pushed herself away from the doorway. "You hungry?" Ethan blinked once. "Depends on how bad your cooking is." For the first time since he met her, Eleanor laughed openly. Soft, brief, real enough to change her whole face for a second. "There is a diner about 10 miles south. Fancy enough for Denver people? Barely fancy enough for truckers." "That sounds more affordable." They drove separately down the county roads toward the diner while late afternoon sunlight broke fully across the plains. Ethan kept his windows down despite the damp air. His truck rattled over potholes while Eleanor's pickup stayed steady ahead of him, dust trailing behind like smoke across the fields. He should have gone home. Clara would be out of school soon. Bills still waited on the kitchen counter. His mortgage payment was already late again. But something about Eleanor Vale kept pulling at him in ways he did not fully trust yet. Maybe because she looked lonely even when standing on thousands of acres of land. Maybe because she hid things badly for someone clearly used to power. Or maybe because for the first time since his wife died, silence beside another person no longer felt empty. The diner sat near the edge of Route 16 beneath a faded neon sign, flickering weakly against the darkening sky. Ethan parked beside Eleanor's pickup and stepped out just as the wind shifted colder again. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled once more, low and far away this time. Eleanor paused before opening the diner door. "One thing," she said quietly without looking at him. "I really do just manage farmland out here." Ethan studied her face carefully. The hesitation, the guardedness, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the door handle after she said it. Then he nodded once. "All right." But neither of them fully believed the conversation they had just finished. The diner smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner and bacon grease soaked deep into the walls over 30 years of truck stops and harvest seasons. Neon from the beer signs painted soft blue and red streaks across the windows, while rainwater still clung to the glass outside in crooked trails. Ethan held the door open for Eleanor without thinking about it. She paused for half a second before stepping inside, as though small gestures like that still surprised her. The waitress behind the counter looked up from refilling sugar dispensers. "Well, look who finally came out of hiding," she called toward Eleanor with a tired smile. Eleanor removed her jacket slowly. "Evening, Marlene. You alive out there in those fields?" "Mostly." Marlene snorted softly and grabbed 2 menus. "Booth by the window. Coffee's fresh for once." Ethan slid into the booth across from Eleanor while country music hummed quietly from an old jukebox near the bathrooms. Outside, trucks hissed along the wet highway, headlights smearing gold across the rain-dark pavement. For a few minutes neither of them spoke much. Marlene brought coffee. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the mug like she was colder than the room allowed. Ethan noticed her fingers first. No polished nails. Small scars near the knuckles. Calluses too faint for heavy labor, but real enough to tell a story. "You really work those fields yourself?" he asked eventually. Eleanor looked up over the rim of her cup. "Sometimes." "That sounds like another half answer. You ask complicated questions." "No, I ask simple ones. You just make them complicated." That earned another faint, almost smile from her. Marlene returned with pie neither of them ordered. "On the house," she muttered before walking away again. Eleanor looked toward the waitress. "She does that for everybody?" "Only people she likes." "Does she like me?" Ethan cut into the pie with his fork. "No idea yet." Eleanor shook her head softly, staring down at the steam rising from her coffee. "You know, most people around here either ask me for favors or avoid me entirely." Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" She hesitated. "People get strange around money." The sentence landed too naturally for someone. Pretending not to have any. Ethan noticed, but let it pass. For now. Outside the window, rain began again in soft, scattered taps against the glass. The diner lights reflected warm across Eleanor's face, while thunder rolled somewhere farther west across the plains. She looked tired suddenly. Not physically. Something deeper than that. Ethan leaned back slightly in the booth. "You ever stop working?" Eleanor glanced at him. "You? Not the same thing." "Why not?" Ethan looked down at his coffee cup for a moment before answering. "Because if I stop working, things disappear." The honesty in his voice surprised even him a little. Eleanor watched him carefully. "Like what?" He shrugged once. "House. Bills getting paid. Maybe college for Clara someday." "You think about that already?" "Every day." Silence settled between them again, softer this time. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Eleanor turned slightly toward the rain-streaked windows. "My father used to say land was the only thing in America people mistake for permanence." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds expensive." She laughed quietly under her breath. "It was." Marlene returned balancing 2 plates of pot roast and mashed potatoes. "Eat before it gets cold," she ordered. Storms knocking power lines out north of town again. Ethan thanked her automatically. Eleanor did too. The older waitress paused beside the table a moment longer than necessary, eyes drifting between them. Then she walked off with the faintest, knowing expression older women sometimes carried without explanation. Ethan noticed it immediately. "What?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing. That means something. Marlene thinks everybody who shares pie is falling in love." Eleanor nearly choked on her coffee. Ethan looked away toward the rain, hiding the small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. For the first time all evening, Eleanor relaxed fully enough to laugh without caution. It changed the air around the booth completely. Warmer somehow. Human. A few minutes later, Ethan's phone buzzed against the table. Clara's name lit the screen. He answered immediately. "Hey, kiddo." Eleanor looked down politely at her plate while Ethan listened. Clara's voice crackled softly through weak reception. "Dad, are you still working?" "Kind of. Mrs. Talbot says the roads might flood again." Ethan glanced outside. Rain was coming down harder now. "I will be home soon." "Okay." A pause. Then quieter. "Did you eat dinner?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Working on it." "Good. Do not just drink coffee again." Eleanor lowered her eyes, hiding another smile. Ethan promised Clara he was on his way before ending the call. When he looked up again, Eleanor was studying him with an expression he could not quite read. "What?" he asked. She shook her head lightly. "Nothing. You do that too, you know." "Do what?" "Answer questions without answering them." Eleanor stared at him for a second longer than necessary before finally speaking. "You sound tired every time you talk to her." Ethan leaned back slowly. "That is because I am. And she still trusts you completely." The words hit somewhere deeper than he expected. Ethan looked out toward the highway where headlights blurred through the storm. "Kids do that," he said quietly, "until you give them a reason not to." Eleanor's expression shifted at that, a shadow crossing briefly behind her eyes. Not disagreement. Recognition. Before Ethan could ask about it, the bell above the diner door jingled sharply. 3 men in expensive rain jackets stepped inside, carrying folders and laptops instead of umbrellas. Corporate clean. City clean. They stopped immediately when they saw Eleanor sitting in the booth. One of them muttered under his breath, "There she is." Eleanor went completely still. The warmth at the table vanished so subtly most people would not have noticed it. But Ethan did. The 3 men carried the kind of silence expensive people often brought into small places without realizing it. Not loud, not rude, just heavy enough to make conversations nearby soften around them. Rain clung to their jackets in dark streaks while polished shoes tapped against the diner floor. The oldest of them spotted Eleanor immediately and stopped near the counter with visible relief. "Ms. Vale," he said carefully. Eleanor closed her eyes for half a second before looking up. Ethan noticed that too. Not fear exactly. Exhaustion. The man approached the booth slowly while the other 2 remained behind him near the coffee station pretending not to stare. "We have been trying to reach you all afternoon." Eleanor's voice stayed calm. "That usually happens when I stop answering calls." The Wichita investors moved the meeting again. "I know. Then you understand why this cannot wait." Marlene glanced over from behind the counter, instantly reading the tension without hearing the words. She quietly turned the diner radio down lower. Ethan sat back slightly in the booth, one arm resting near his untouched coffee. He suddenly felt underdressed in a way he had not 5 minutes earlier. The older man shifted his attention briefly toward him. "I apologize. We did not mean to interrupt dinner." "You did not," Ethan answered evenly. "We were already getting interrupted." For the first time, Eleanor almost smiled again. The man caught it and seemed surprised by it. "Miss Vale," he said more quietly now, "the board is getting nervous." Ethan's eyes lifted slightly at the word board. Eleanor folded her napkin carefully beside her plate before responding. Then perhaps they should spend less time being nervous and more time fixing the freight contracts they buried last quarter. One of the younger men behind the older executive visibly stiffened. Ethan looked at Eleanor differently after that. Not because she sounded rich, because she sounded used to being obeyed. The older man lowered his voice further. "This is not the place." "Exactly," Eleanor replied. "So leave." Silence followed. Rain rattled harder against the windows. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clinked softly while a truck downshifted loudly outside on the wet highway. The man finally nodded once. "Very well." He slipped a slim leather folder onto the edge of the booth table. "But this cannot keep waiting forever." Eleanor did not touch it. The 3 men left as quietly as they came. disappearing back into the storm and leaving the diner strangely smaller afterward. For several seconds, neither Ethan nor Eleanor spoke. Marlene eventually walked over with the coffee pot and topped off their cups without asking. "You all right, honey?" she asked Eleanor gently. Eleanor looked up. "Yeah." Marlene studied her for another moment like she did not entirely believe it, then squeezed her shoulder once before walking away. Ethan watched the rain slide down the windows in crooked silver lines. "So," he said finally. Eleanor stared into her coffee. "So, you got aboard now?" She gave the faintest tired laugh. "Apparently." Ethan waited. Eleanor remained quiet long enough that he almost let the question go. Then she surprised him. "My family owns agricultural companies," she admitted softly. "Companies, farms, distribution, shipping." Ethan leaned back slightly. "That sounds bigger than managing a few fields." "It is." She finally looked up at him then, and for the first time since he met her, there was no performance in her expression, just weariness. "I did not lie about the fields. You just skipped a few details." "A few." Ethan rubbed his thumb slowly along the rim of his coffee cup. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the highway, briefly turning the whole diner white before darkness settled back in. "Why stay here?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked toward the storm outside instead of him. "Because nobody out here cared who I was when I was younger. And now." A long pause. "Now they do." Ethan thought about the black SUV, the envelope, Walter Grayson, the men calling her Miss Vale like they worked for senators instead of farms. It should have made him uncomfortable. Somehow it mostly made him sad for her. "You know," he said carefully, "normal people usually mention if they own shipping companies." Eleanor laughed softly through her nose. "You know what happens when they do." "What?" "Nobody sees anything else after that." Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than before. The storm outside deepened around the diner windows while warm yellow light settled softly across the booth between them. He understood more than he wanted to admit. People stopped seeing him too after certain words. Widower. Late payments. Single father. Broke. Everyone carried labels eventually. Some just were nicer ones. Eleanor glanced at his nearly untouched plate. "You stopped eating. You stopped pretending you were normal." That earned a real smile this time. Small but honest. Fair enough. They finished dinner more quietly after that. Comfortable in stretches. Awkward in others. But no longer pretending entirely. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had eased into a cold mist drifting across the parking lot beneath flickering neon. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter against the wind while Eleanor stood beside her truck looking up at the dark clouds moving slowly across the plains. "You should get home before the roads wash out," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Clara is probably already worried." Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. "She seems like a good kid." "She is. She talks about you like you can fix anything." Ethan looked down briefly, almost smiling. "That makes one person." Eleanor's expression softened at that. Wind lifted strands of damp hair across her face. Without thinking much about it, Ethan reached out and gently brushed one loose strand away before he could stop himself. The movement was small, careful, but the second his fingers touched her cheek, both of them froze slightly. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt familiar in a way neither expected. Eleanor looked at him differently then. Quieter, closer somehow. Ethan pulled his hand back slowly. "Sorry. Do not apologize." The words came almost too softly to hear over the wind. They stood there a moment longer beneath the glow of the diner sign, while rain whispered across the empty highway around them. Then headlights suddenly appeared at the far end of the parking lot. Another black SUV. Slower this time. Deliberate. Eleanor's entire posture changed the instant she saw it. Not fear. Something colder. Resignation, maybe. Ethan followed her gaze as the vehicle rolled toward them through the mist. And this time, before it even stopped, he noticed the license plate frame stamped quietly in silver lettering beneath the headlights. Vale Agricultural Holdings. The second SUV stopped without urgency, its headlights cutting pale ribbons through the drifting mist across the diner parking lot. Rain tapped softly against the hood of Ethan's pickup while the neon sign above them buzzed faintly in blue and red. Eleanor did not move. The warmth from moments earlier disappeared from her face so gradually it almost hurt to watch. Ethan stood beside her beneath the weak glow of the diner lights, hands shoved into his jacket pockets against the cold wind rolling off the plains. The passenger door of the SUV opened first. A younger woman stepped out holding a tablet against her chest, heels sinking awkwardly into wet gravel. Early 30s. Sharp coat. Hair pulled tight enough to look painful. She spotted Eleanor and immediately exhaled in relief. Thank God. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Dana, you vanished for 3 days. I was busy. Dana glanced toward Ethan before lowering her voice. You cannot keep doing this. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Doing what? Pretending none of this exists. The driver's side door opened next. Another man climbed out carrying a garment bag and several folders protected beneath his coat from the rain. Everything about them screamed city. Meetings. Airports. Deadlines. Ethan suddenly became aware of the mud on his boots again. Dana approached carefully, softening slightly. The shareholders' call starts tomorrow morning. Singapore already threatened to pull shipping allocations if you miss another quarter review. Ethan stared at Eleanor. Shipping allocations. Shareholders. This was no longer family farmland with a few corporate branches attached. This sounded enormous. Eleanor folded her arms tightly against the cold. I said I would handle it. No, Dana answered quietly. You said you needed time. Wind swept hard through the parking lot then, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant rain-soaked wheat fields. A truck thundered past on the highway, headlights briefly flooding across all of them before disappearing again into darkness. Ethan noticed the way Eleanor looked toward the road afterward, like part of her wanted to follow it and never stop driving. Dana finally looked directly at him. I am sorry. We are not trying to intrude. Ethan gave a small shrug. Seems popular tonight. To his surprise, Dana smiled faintly at that. You must be Ethan Brooks. Eleanor's eyes snapped. Toward her immediately. Dana. What? Dana blinked innocently. Walter said your mechanic friend had a name. Mechanic friend. Something about the phrase bothered Ethan more than it should have. Eleanor noticed the shift in his expression instantly. So did Dana. Silence settled awkwardly for a beat too long. Then Eleanor spoke without looking at anyone. You should all head back. Dana lowered her voice carefully. Eleanor, they are trying to vote around you. That changed everything. Ethan saw it happen in real time. The exhaustion, the frustration, the quiet loneliness she carried beneath every conversation. It suddenly made sense in ways he had not expected. This was not just a wealthy woman hiding in Kansas fields because she liked tractors and storms. She was running from something. Or maybe from everyone. Eleanor looked toward the dark horizon beyond the highway. I know. Dana hesitated before speaking again. Your father trusted you with this company because you cared about the land more than the numbers. And look where that got him. The words came out sharper than intended. Dana flinched slightly. Ethan stayed quiet. He should not have been hearing any of this, but somehow leaving felt impossible now. Rain misted softly through the parking lot lights. Eleanor rubbed her hands against her jacket sleeves, suddenly looking less like a powerful executive and more like someone carrying too much weight alone for too long. Dana's expression softened. You do not have to carry all of it by yourself. Eleanor laughed quietly under her breath. Not amused. That is literally the job. Ethan finally spoke. What exactly is this company? Both women looked toward him at once. Eleanor answered first. Agriculture. That is not really an answer anymore. Another truck passed on the highway, rattling the diner windows. Dana glanced at Eleanor for permission before speaking carefully. Vale Agricultural Holdings manages farmland, grain transport, equipment manufacturing, exports, she paused. A lot of exports. Ethan frowned slowly. He had heard the name before. Everybody had. Grain silos with the Vale logo sat beside interstate highways all across the Midwest. His father used to curse their freight pricing during drought years. Ethan looked back at Eleanor differently now. Not intimidated exactly. Just trying to reconcile the woman standing in muddy boots beside him with the kind of wealth that changed how entire counties survived. Eleanor noticed. That hurt more than she expected. You should go home, she said softly to Ethan without meeting his eyes. The distance in her voice appeared instantly, like a door quietly closing between them. Ethan stared at her for a moment. You asking me to leave? I am saying this is not your problem. Seems like it is yours. Exactly. Dana watched the exchange silently, picking up on something unspoken between them. Eleanor turned away before Ethan could answer again. I will come back tomorrow morning, she told Dana. Good. Dana exhaled in relief. The board charter flight leaves Wichita at 9. Ethan blinked once. Charter flight. The words sounded absurd standing beside muddy pickup trucks outside a roadside diner. Eleanor finally looked back at him, and for the first time since they met, there was uncertainty in her eyes about what he thought of her now. Not fear of judgment exactly. Something sadder. The possibility of being seen differently. Ethan shifted his weight slowly. You got your own plane? Eleanor gave the faintest tired smile. Apparently. He almost laughed despite himself. Almost. But something complicated had settled between them now. The simplicity was gone. The storm had changed shape. Dana gently touched Eleanor's arm. Come back tonight at least. The hotel suite is already reserved. Eleanor pulled her arm away instinctively. I am not staying in Wichita. Then where? Eleanor hesitated. Ethan noticed. Dana noticed too. The silence stretched just long enough to become revealing. Finally, Eleanor answered quietly. I have somewhere else to be. Dana followed her gaze toward Ethan without meaning to. The realization on her face arrived instantly. Eleanor saw it too late. Ethan felt at the moment the air changed between all three of them. Dana recovered quickly, stepping back toward the SUV. Fine. Tomorrow morning then. She climbed inside while the other assistant loaded folders and the garment bag into the back seat. Seconds later, the SUV pulled away into the rain-dark highway, taillights fading red against the storm. Silence returned. Bigger this time. Eleanor kept staring at the road long after the vehicle disappeared. Ethan looked at her profile beneath the diner lights. The tiredness, the guardedness, the loneliness she could no longer hide completely. You really own all that? He asked quietly. Eleanor folded her arms tighter against the cold wind. Sometimes I think it owns me. Neither of them moved for a long moment after that. Rain drifted softly across the empty parking lot, while thunder rolled low over the distant fields. Then Eleanor finally turned toward him again, her voice quieter than before. Can I ask you something? Ethan nodded once. She looked down briefly before speaking. Would Clara mind if I came by tomorrow evening? Ethan frowned slightly, surprised by the question more than the answer forming inside him. Eleanor looked almost uncomfortable waiting for it. Vulnerable in a way he had not seen yet. Why? He asked gently. Eleanor glanced toward the storm-dark highway where the SUVs had disappeared. Because I think I forgot what normal feels like. And for the first time since his wife died, Ethan Brooks did not know whether opening the door to someone felt more dangerous or more necessary. The drive back to Hollow Creek felt quieter than any road Ethan Brooks could remember. Rain drifted across the windshield in thin silver streaks, while the wipers pushed back and forth with tired rhythm beneath the low growl of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the plains. Eleanor followed behind him in her pickup for nearly 15 miles, headlights steady in his rearview mirror through the dark county roads cutting between endless stretches of soaked farmland. Neither of them called. Neither tried to explain the conversation outside the diner. But the silence between them had changed shape now. It was no longer built from curiosity alone. It carried awareness. By the time Ethan turned onto the gravel driveway leading toward his farmhouse, the rain had softened into mist again. Porch lights glowed warm against the darkness while Clara sat cross-legged inside, near the front window, still awake despite the late hour. The moment Ethan parked, she pushed open the front door and ran onto the porch in mismatched socks. You are late. Ethan stepped out of the truck with a tired smile. That usually happens when grown-ups make bad decisions after dinner. Clara folded her arms dramatically. Mrs. Talbot said roads flooded near Miller Bridge. And yet here I am. Then she noticed Eleanor's pickup pulling slowly in behind Ethan's truck. Clara's expression changed instantly. Curious. Bright. Eleanor stepped out into the cold mist, jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, her hair still damp from the rain. For the first time since Ethan met her, she looked uncertain about walking toward a house instead of a boardroom or a field. Clara waved anyway. Hi. Eleanor smiled softly. Hi. The farmhouse smelled like cinnamon tea and old pine wood the moment they stepped inside. Warm light from the kitchen lamps softened the worn wallpaper and faded photographs lining the hallway. Nothing matched perfectly anymore. Some furniture had scratches. The ceiling fan clicked every third rotation. But the place felt lived in. Human. Eleanor paused quietly near the doorway, taking it all in while Ethan hung his jacket beside the door. Clara noticed immediately. It looks smaller at night, she informed Eleanor seriously. Ethan snorted softly from the kitchen. That is not how houses work. Feels true, though. Eleanor's eyes drifted slowly across the room. The framed school photos. The stack of unpaid envelopes near the counter Ethan had forgotten to move. A faded piano tucked beside the living room wall beneath a lamp missing its shade. The silence in the house did not feel lonely anymore. That unsettled her more than she expected. Clara climbed onto one of the kitchen stools. Do rich people really fly in private jets? Ethan nearly dropped the kettle. Eleanor blinked once before laughing quietly under her breath. That is a very direct question. Dad says avoiding questions means the answer is yes. Ethan pointed toward Clara without turning around. I have literally never said that. You imply it emotionally. Eleanor laughed again, softer this time. Genuine enough that Ethan caught himself staring at her for half a second too long. Clara noticed that too. Children noticed everything. Ethan busied himself pouring tea into chipped mugs while rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows. Eleanor rested one hand lightly against the counter, watching the steam rise from her cup. I do not own a jet personally, she answered eventually. Clara frowned. But you could. Probably. Clara looked impressed in a way only 11-year-olds could manage without judgment. That is insane. Ethan handed Eleanor a mug carefully. Their fingers brushed briefly. The contact lingered longer than either meant it to. Eleanor lowered her eyes first. Thank you. They settled into the living room afterward while the storm drifted farther east across the plains. Clara sat cross-legged on the rug sketching in a notebook, while Ethan adjusted the old piano bench near the wall. Eleanor noticed immediately. You play? Ethan shook his head. My wife did. The room softened after that sentence. Not awkward, just quieter. Eleanor looked toward the piano keys, yellowed slightly with age. And Clara? Ethan glanced toward his daughter. Learning. Clara shrugged without looking up from her notebook. I mess up a lot. That is usually how learning works, Eleanor said gently. Clara studied her a moment. You sound like my music teacher except less scary. Ethan laughed quietly into his coffee cup. Eleanor looked almost surprised by the sound of it. They talked easier after that. About weather. School. Old county fairs Hollow Creek used to have before budgets dried up. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, but Ethan noticed something strange slowly happening every time Clara included her naturally in conversation. Eleanor relaxed. Not fully, but enough that the sharpness around her shoulders faded little by little beneath the warm house lights. Then Clara suddenly asked, Why do you stay out in those fields alone all the time? The question landed gently but directly. Eleanor looked toward the rain-dark windows before answering. Sometimes people are quieter out there. Clara tilted her head. You mean nicer? Eleanor smiled faintly. Not always. Ethan watched her carefully over the rim of his mug. There it was again. The loneliness beneath the wealth. The exhaustion beneath the polished answers. Before anyone could speak again, headlights swept suddenly across the front windows. Bright. Slow. Deliberate. Ethan frowned immediately. Who would be out here this late? The vehicle outside was not another SUV this time. It was a dark county sedan. Eleanor's expression changed the second she saw it. Not panic. Worse. Recognition. A knock sounded heavily against the front door. Clara looked up from the floor. Ethan set down his mug slowly and walked toward the entryway while wind rattled the porch screen outside. He opened the door to find Roy Mercer standing there in a raincoat, hat dripping water onto the porch boards. But Roy was not looking at Ethan. He was staring past him into the house at Eleanor. His weathered face had gone pale beneath the porch light. Lord help me, Roy muttered quietly under his breath. It really is you. The room behind Ethan fell completely silent. Rain dripped steadily from Roy Mercer's hat brim onto the porch boards while the old farmer stood frozen beneath the weak yellow porch light, staring past Ethan like he had just seen a ghost walk into town. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth from the kitchen suddenly felt thinner somehow. Eleanor remained near the piano, one hand still resting lightly against the chipped wooden bench. Clara looked between all three adults with growing confusion. Ethan frowned. Roy. Roy slowly stepped inside, removing his hat without taking his eyes off Eleanor. Miss Vale, he said quietly this time, almost respectfully. Eleanor gave a small nod. Mr. Mercer. The formality of it landed heavily in the tiny farmhouse. Ethan noticed Clara glance toward him immediately. She sensed the shift even if she did not understand it yet. Roy looked embarrassed suddenly, like he regretted saying too much too fast. I did not realize. He stopped himself and looked toward Ethan. Sorry. I just came to tell you Miller Bridge finally flooded over. Sheriff's offices. Closing the North Road till morning. Ethan leaned against the doorway slightly. Appreciate it. But Roy stayed standing there awkwardly instead of leaving. His eyes drifted back toward Eleanor again. Your father used to come through Hollow Creek every harvest season, he said carefully. Long before all the corporations and freight contracts. Eleanor's expression softened almost invisibly. I remember. Roy gave a tired nod. Good man. He could be. The answer carried more weight than Ethan expected. Roy cleared his throat. Well, anyway, roads are dangerous tonight. His attention shifted briefly toward Ethan before settling back on Eleanor. Folks around here still remember what the Vale family did for this county during the drought years. Ethan noticed the phrasing immediately. Folks around here. Remember. Respect. It sounded less like conversation and more like history standing in his living room. Roy finally stepped back toward the porch door. Good night, Ethan. Then after a pause. Miss Vale. The rain swallowed him again moments later, leaving only the fading glow of his truck taillights through the storm-dark fields. Silence settled heavily across the farmhouse afterward. Clara looked toward Eleanor first. You are famous? Eleanor blinked once, caught somewhere between amusement and exhaustion. No, Clara tilted her head. That did not sound like a no. Ethan walked slowly back toward the kitchen, grabbing the coffee pot mostly to give his hand something to do. Clara. What? Everybody keeps acting weird. Eleanor looked down at the piano keys beneath her fingertips. Sometimes adults carry old stories around longer than they should. Clara considered that seriously. That sounds depressing. Ethan almost smiled despite himself while pouring fresh coffee into his mug. But something inside him had shifted again after seeing Roy's reaction. Respect was one thing. Reverence was another. The pieces no longer fit together comfortably. Eleanor had spent days pretending she simply managed a few fields while half the county apparently knew her family name like it was stitched into the land itself. And somehow he was the last person figuring it out. Clara eventually disappeared down the hallway to get ready for bed, leaving the house quieter again beneath the soft hum of rain and the occasional creak of old pipes settling in the walls. Eleanor remained by the piano while Ethan stood near the sink staring out into darkness beyond the kitchen window. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence softly. You are angry. Ethan shook his head once. No, that sounded convincing. He leaned one hand against the counter. I just do not know what is real with you yet. The honesty landed harder than raised voices ever could have. Eleanor looked down briefly. That is fair. Ethan turned toward her finally. You said people treat you differently when they know who you are. They do. Maybe because you never give them the chance to know anything else first. Eleanor absorbed the words quietly. No defense. No sharp comeback. That somehow made it worse. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant thunder rolled low across the plains. The farmhouse lights flickered once before steadying again. Ethan rubbed tired fingers across his jaw. I keep finding out things about you from everybody except you. Eleanor's eyes lifted slowly toward him. I did not tell you because I liked being here without all of that attached to me. And what exactly is all of that? For the first time since they met, Eleanor looked genuinely unsure how to answer. Expectations, she said finally. People needing things. People assuming things. Conversations changing the second they hear my last name. Ethan gave a quiet, dry laugh. Yeah, well, hard to avoid that when people show up in black SUVs calling you before midnight board meetings. The words were not cruel, but they still hurt. Eleanor felt it immediately. She folded her arms tighter against herself though the house was warm. You think I wanted any of this tonight? I think you knew it would catch up eventually. Silence stretched between them. Longer this time. Heavier. Eleanor looked toward the family photos lining the shelves near the hallway. Clara missing her front teeth at age 7. Ethan holding a birthday cake beside his late wife beneath. Summer porch lights years ago. Simple moments framed in cheap wood. Real moments. Your house feels honest, Eleanor said quietly. Ethan frowned slightly at the sudden shift. What does that mean? Exactly what I said. Her eyes drifted toward the piano again. Nothing in here is pretending to be something else. Ethan looked around his worn kitchen with unpaid bills still stacked near the toaster and old boots drying by the back door. Trust me, some things in here are hanging on by threads. Eleanor nodded faintly. Still honest. The compliment unsettled him more than it should have, because somewhere beneath the frustration and confusion, he understood exactly what she meant. This house did not impress anyone. It simply existed. And maybe that was what she kept coming back for. Clara padded quietly back into the living room in oversized pajamas carrying her sketchbook. Power flickered again, she announced. If the lights go out, can Miss Vale stay here? Ethan blinked once. Eleanor looked equally caught off guard. Clara, what? Roads are flooded. Clara climbed onto the couch like the question made perfect sense. And she looks sad when she leaves. The room fell completely still after that. Children always found the truth adults spent entire conversations avoiding. Eleanor lowered her eyes first. Ethan stared at the floorboards for a second longer than necessary. Finally, he exhaled softly through his nose. Guest room still leaks when it rains. Eleanor looked up at him carefully. I do not mind. Outside, wind swept across the fields again, rattling the old farmhouse windows while rain whispered steadily against the roof. And somewhere deep beneath Ethan's confusion, beneath the distance beginning to grow between what Eleanor said and who she actually was, another feeling had started taking root quietly inside him. One that made everything far more dangerous than either of them wanted to admit. The guest room smelled faintly like cedar wood and old rain. Eleanor stood alone beside the narrow bed while wind pressed softly against the farmhouse windows and thunder rolled low across the plains beyond Hollow Creek. A single lamp near the dresser cast warm amber light across peeling wallpaper and a quilt stitched decades ago by hands she would never know. The room was simple in a way her life had stopped being years earlier. No marble floors. No polished glass. No assistants waiting outside conference doors. Just an old house breathing quietly around her while rain tapped against the roof. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at her phone screen glowing cold in the darkness. 15 missed calls. 9 emails marked urgent. 3 messages from Dana. 1 from Walter. Another board vote had been scheduled for morning. Her thumb hovered over the screen for several seconds before she turned the phone face down instead. Down the hallway, she could hear muffled sounds from the kitchen. Cabinet doors opening softly. Clara laughing once at something Ethan said too quietly to hear clearly. The sound hit her harder than she expected. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was ordinary. And she realized with sudden painful clarity how long it had been since she had belonged anywhere ordinary at all. Ethan stood alone at the kitchen sink rinsing coffee mugs while Clara dried dishes beside him in oversized pajamas 2 sizes too big. Rainwater slid down the dark windows over the sink while the old clock above the stove ticked steadily toward midnight. Clara glanced toward the hallway leading to the guest room. She seems lonely. Ethan kept his eyes on the sink. Kiddo, I am serious. She dried another plate carefully. People who have everything are not supposed to look sad all the time. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. Money does not fix everything. Clara studied him quietly. Mom used to say that too. The room softened instantly after that. Ethan turned off the faucet slowly, hands resting against the edge of the sink. For a second, he almost saw his wife standing there again beneath the kitchen lights, humming quietly, while winter storms rolled across the fields outside. Grief did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slipped into rooms gently and sat down beside you like it had never left. Clara noticed the shift in his face immediately. Sorry. Ethan shook his head once and forced a small smile. Nothing to apologize for. She looked toward the hallway again. Do you like her? The question landed harder than expected. Ethan grabbed the dish towel mostly to avoid answering too quickly. She is complicated. Clara shrugged. You are complicated too. Thanks. I mean sad complicated. Ethan looked down at the counter. Rain rattled softly against the roof. Go brush your teeth. Clara smiled faintly, kissed his shoulder quickly on her way past, then disappeared down the hallway. Ethan remained alone in the kitchen afterward, staring out into darkness beyond the fields while exhaustion settled heavily across his shoulders. The truth was he did like Eleanor. More than he should. More than made sense. But every hour revealed another distance between their worlds he could not ignore. Charter flights. Shareholders. Black SUVs arriving after midnight. People in expensive coats speaking to her like entire industries depended on her decisions. Meanwhile, he was behind on mortgage payments and patching roof leaks with borrowed tools. Somewhere along the line, the warmth between them had started colliding against reality. Eleanor appeared quietly in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, wearing one of Clara's oversized sweaters she had borrowed for the night. Her hair was loose now, falling softly around tired eyes still shadowed by the long day. Ethan looked away almost immediately, because something about seeing her there felt too intimate for a man trying not to hope. Could not sleep, he asked. Eleanor shook her head lightly. Storm's loud. Ethan poured fresh coffee, without asking if she wanted any. She accepted the mug carefully. Their fingers did not touch this time. Silence settled between them, while wind moved softly through cracks around the old windows. Eleanor leaned against the counter near him. Your daughter is kind. She gets that from her mother. Eleanor nodded faintly. You say that a lot. Ethan stared into his coffee. Because it is true. Another silence followed. Not comfortable anymore. Careful. Eleanor finally looked toward him directly. You think differently about me now. Ethan did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. She lowered her eyes first. I knew this would happen. What would? The second people started showing up. The second names and companies entered the room. Ethan rubbed tired fingers across his jaw. You made it sound small, Eleanor. I wanted it to feel small. Why? Her voice softened almost to a whisper. Because I liked the way you looked at me before you knew. Ethan turned toward the sink again, jaw tightening slightly. Outside, lightning flashed pale across the windows before darkness returned. You think I care about your money? No, she answered honestly. I think you care about honesty. The sentence cut deeper because it was true. Ethan leaned both hands against the counter, exhausted suddenly in a way sleep would not fix. I do not even know what parts of your life are real anymore. Eleanor absorbed that quietly. Her eyes shimmered slightly beneath the kitchen light, though she never cried. The fields are real. That is not enough. Silence again. Heavy now. Painfully human. Eleanor stared down at the coffee cup, warming her hands. You know what the strange part is? She asked softly. Ethan did not answer. I spent years around people who only wanted things from me. And somehow tonight is the first time I have felt ashamed of what I have. Ethan finally looked at her then. Truly looked. Not the executive. Not the hidden billionaire everyone else seemed to recognize instantly. Just a tired woman standing barefoot in an old farmhouse kitchen while rain whispered across the roof overhead. But instead of bringing them closer, the moment only deepened the ache between them. Because now he understood her loneliness. And understanding made distance hurt worse. Eleanor set the untouched coffee mug down carefully on the counter. I should leave in the morning before Clara wakes up. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. But he nodded anyway. Probably easier. Eleanor looked at him for one long quiet second after that. There were 100 things neither of them said. Stay. Do not disappear. I was starting to trust this too. Instead, she simply gave a small nod and stepped away from the kitchen. Ethan listened to her footsteps fade slowly down the hallway until only the storm remained. He stood there alone beneath the dim kitchen light long after midnight, staring at the second untouched coffee cup cooling beside the sink, while somewhere deep in the house old floorboards creaked softly around a woman who suddenly felt farther away than when he first met her beside a broken tractor. Morning arrived quietly over Hollow Creek, pale gray lights stretching across soaked wheat fields while fog drifted low above the county roads like smoke that had forgotten where it came from. The storm had finally moved east sometime before dawn, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in cold stillness broken only by distant birdsong and the soft creak of old pipes warming beneath the floorboards. Ethan Brooks woke early out of habit more than rest. He stood alone at the kitchen sink in a faded thermal shirt, staring out at the fields behind the house, while coffee brewed slowly beside him. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor standing in the kitchen beneath dim yellow light, saying she should leave before Clara woke up. And somehow the thought bothered him more than it should have. Footsteps creaked softly behind him. Ethan turned slightly, expecting Clara. Instead, Eleanor stood near the hallway entrance, already dressed in yesterday's jeans and boots, her hair loosely tied back, as if she had been awake for hours. She held herself differently this morning, more guarded again. The warmth from the night before had folded back inward somewhere during the dark. Morning, Ethan said quietly. Morning. Neither moved closer. Steam rose between them from the coffee pot, while weak sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains in soft gray bands. Ethan grabbed another mug automatically and poured coffee without asking. Eleanor accepted it with both hands. Thank you. Silence settled again. Not hostile, just bruised. Ethan noticed her suitcase sitting near the front door. Somehow seeing it there made the kitchen feel smaller. Roads should be clear by now, he said after a moment. Eleanor nodded once. Dana already texted twice. You heading to Wichita? Eventually. Ethan leaned against the counter, studying the coffee in his mug instead of her face. Sounds important. Eleanor gave a faint, tired smile that never fully formed. Apparently, the future of American grain exports cannot survive without me for 48 hours. Ethan almost laughed despite himself. Almost. Then Clara appeared down the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes in oversized pajamas. She stopped immediately when she saw Eleanor dressed to leave. The disappointment crossed her face too quickly to hide. You are leaving already? Eleanor softened instantly at the sight of her. I have work. Clara climbed onto a stool slowly. Dad has work too. He still stays. Ethan shot her a look. Kiddo, what? It is true. Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly into her coffee cup. Your father's work matters more than he thinks. Ethan looked at her then, really looked. There was no performance in the sentence. No polished executive charm. Just honesty. Clara yawned dramatically and rested her chin against the counter. Can rich people call in sick? Ethan muttered under his breath. I am begging you to stop asking questions before breakfast. But Eleanor laughed softly for the first time that morning. The sound eased something in the room immediately. Clara noticed too. There it is, she whispered proudly like she had solved a puzzle. Eleanor tilted her head. What? You smile different here. Ethan looked away toward the window before Eleanor could see the reaction on his face. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds in thin golden strips across the wet fields. For a few quiet minutes, they shared breakfast together in the small kitchen, while old country radio hummed softly near the stove. Clara talked about school. Ethan fixed the loose cabinet hinge while standing beside the sink. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, but something about watching ordinary life unfold around her seemed to steady her breathing in ways conference rooms never could. Then Clara suddenly disappeared down the hallway and returned carrying a dusty cardboard box almost too big for her arms. I found this in the hall closet, she announced proudly. Ethan frowned immediately. Clara. But she already set the box onto the kitchen table. Old photographs spilled partly loose from the top. Eleanor froze the second she saw them. Ethan recognized the box instantly. His wife used to keep old community fair photos and county newspaper clippings there before she passed. Clara picked up one faded photograph carefully. Look. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. Too late. Eleanor had already seen it. The picture showed two much younger men standing beside a broken combine during a drought sometime in the late 1980s. One was Ethan's father, Thomas Brooks, grinning beneath a sweat-stained baseball cap. The other wore a crisp, white button-down shirt rolled at the sleeves despite the heat. Eleanor's father, younger, healthier, standing shoulder to shoulder beside the machine like old friends. Silence filled the kitchen completely. Clara looked between them. You know him? Eleanor reached slowly for the photograph with almost trembling fingers. Yeah, she whispered softly. I do. Ethan stared at the image, confusion pulling across his face. My dad never mentioned knowing your family. Eleanor kept her eyes on the photograph. That sounds like him. Ethan frowned deeper. What does that mean? Eleanor swallowed once before answering. Your father worked on several of our farms during the drought years. Worked on? Saved them. Ethan blinked once. Eleanor finally looked up at him then. One summer almost every machine we had broke down during harvest. Freight contracts were collapsing. My father thought we were finished. She paused lightly, eyes drifting back toward the photograph. Thomas Brooks spent nearly 3 weeks repairing equipment day and night. Refused extra money. Refused ownership shares. Said the county needed those farms operating or half the town would lose jobs before winter. Ethan stared at her silently. He had never heard this story. Not once. Clara looked openly fascinated now. Grandpa saved your farm? Eleanor smiled faintly through something heavier than nostalgia. Looks that way. Ethan sat slowly at the table, eyes still fixed on the photograph. Pieces were beginning to move inside him now. Roy Mercer's reaction. The respect in Walter's voice. The strange familiarity Eleanor carried around this county like she had inherited something invisible. Why did nobody ever tell me this? He asked quietly. Eleanor's expression softened. Maybe because men like your father did not think kindness needed witnesses. The sentence settled deep into the room. Ethan looked down at the old photograph again. His father's grin. Grease on his hands. Two men standing in Kansas heat before corporations and boardrooms, and all the distance that came later. Clara leaned against Eleanor's shoulder naturally without thinking about it. You should stay for dinner again. Ethan opened his mouth automatically to protest. But Eleanor answered first, very softly. I would like that. Then her phone buzzed sharply across the kitchen counter. The sound shattered the quiet instantly. Eleanor glanced at the screen. Her entire expression changed. Not fear. Something colder. Ethan noticed immediately. What is it? Eleanor looked at him for one long second before answering. The board moved the vote up. Outside the kitchen window, a black SUV had already appeared at the far end of the gravel road leading toward the farmhouse. The black SUV turned slowly into the gravel driveway, as if it had permission from the land itself, its tires crunching through wet earth beneath a sky that had finally begun to break open after days of storm. Behind it came another vehicle, then another, until the narrow country road outside Ethan Brooks's farmhouse filled with the quiet weight of engines shutting off one by one. Ethan stood on the porch beside Clara, Eleanor slightly behind him, all three watching without speaking as doors opened and people stepped out into the morning light. Some wore suits. Some wore field jackets. One carried a briefcase like it mattered more than the ground beneath his feet. Walter Grayson was the first to approach, followed by Dana and two senior board members Ethan had only ever seen indirectly through Eleanor's brief, guarded explanations. But today there was no distance in their arrival. No anonymity. They were here. All of them. Even Roy Mercer's truck appeared at the far edge of the road and slowed to a stop, as if drawn by something older than business. Roy stepped out slowly, hat in hand, eyes narrowing as he took in the gathering. Morning, he said quietly, though nobody answered him at first. Eleanor stepped forward into the yard. For the first time since Ethan met her, she was not hiding behind language or hesitation. She looked exhausted, but steady in a way that made even Walter pause. You called a vote without me, she said to him calmly. Walter adjusted his coat. The board cannot wait for personal delays anymore, Eleanor. Dana's eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan and Clara, then away again. We have lost 3 export contracts this quarter due to inconsistent leadership presence. A silence followed that statement, heavy and rehearsed. Ethan stood still, one hand resting lightly on the porch railing, trying to understand why all of this felt like it had nothing to do with him, and yet everything at the same time. Eleanor turned slightly toward the gathered group. Then let us stop pretending this is about presence. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The wind moved gently through the wheat fields behind them, carrying the sound of distant birds and the soft creak of an old windmill somewhere beyond the barn. This is about control, she continued, and whether this company belongs to spreadsheets or the land it was built on. A board member stepped forward. We are here to stabilize Vail Agricultural Holdings, not romanticize it. That word hit the air differently. Romanticize. Ethan felt Clara shift beside him without looking up. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. You want stability? She asked quietly. Then listen. She turned slightly toward Ethan, and something in her expression softened just enough that the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. 3 days ago, she said, I did not tell you everything, Ethan, because I did not think it mattered anymore. Ethan did not move. But it does, she added. She stepped closer to him now, not touching him, but close enough that the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. Your father's name is not just in our archives, she said. It is in the reason this company still exists. Roy. Mercer shifted slightly at the edge of the yard, his brows lowering as if he had already suspected pieces of this story for years, but never heard them said aloud. Walter frowned. Eleanor, that is not relevant to today's. It is everything, she cut in softly. Then she turned back toward the group. During the drought years, Vail Agricultural Holdings was one failed harvest away from collapse. Freight costs were destroying rural operations across 5 states. Equipment was breaking faster than we could replace it. We were preparing to shut down entire regions. Dana's expression changed subtly, like she already knew where this was going. Eleanor's voice lowered. And then a man from Hollow Creek fixed machines no one else could repair. refused payment beyond what was fair, refused ownership shares, refused recognition. She looked at Ethan now. Thomas Brooks kept entire counties functioning long enough for us to survive long enough to become what we are today. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause across the fields. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough that his breath caught without permission. Clara looked up at him slowly, like she was seeing her grandfather for the first time through someone else's words. Roy Mercer removed his hat completely now. Walter exhaled slowly, but not in disagreement. In recalculation. That is not in any current board documentation, Walter said carefully. Eleanor nodded. It was never meant to be. She reached into the folder Dana had brought earlier and placed it on the hood of the nearest SUV. Until now. Dana stepped forward hesitantly. Eleanor. But Eleanor did not look at her. She looked at Ethan. I asked you last night why you stay when everything takes from you, she said softly. I think I understand the answer now. Ethan shook his head slightly, still trying to process the weight of what he was hearing. This is about my father? This is about what your father protected, she corrected gently. She opened the folder. Inside were contracts, old agreements, handwritten amendments, photographs, names, signatures that tied Ethan's family name to. Land holdings across sections of the county most people assumed had always belonged to corporations. Roy Mercer stepped forward slowly now, voice rough. Son. Ethan looked at him briefly, confused. We all knew your father mattered, Roy said quietly. We just did not know how much until he was gone. Clara took Ethan's hand without saying anything. That small gesture nearly broke him more than anything else. Walter finally spoke again, quieter now. Eleanor, if this documentation is valid, it is, she said. Then the structure of this company's regional ownership must be reviewed immediately. No, Eleanor answered simply. Everyone looked at her. Even Ethan. She closed the folder slowly. There will be no hostile restructuring. No removal of land rights. No corporate consolidation that strips families like his from what they built. Dana blinked. That will cost the company billions in projected revenue. Eleanor nodded once. Then it costs what it costs. The words landed heavier than any argument could have. Walter studied her for a long moment. You are making an irreversible decision. Eleanor's eyes did not move from Ethan. I am making the only one that makes sense. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Walter closed his own folder. One by one, the others did the same. Not in defeat. In recognition. Something older than contracts had entered the conversation, and none of them could ignore it anymore. Roy Mercer gave a quiet nod, almost to himself. Your daddy would have liked that, he said toward Ethan. Ethan did not answer immediately. He could not. Because something inside him was breaking in a different way now. Not from loss. From understanding. Eleanor stepped closer to him again, her voice lower now, almost private despite everyone still standing there. I did not come to your farmhouse because I needed a mechanic, she said softly. I came because for the first time in a long time, someone was treating the world like it still mattered. Ethan finally met her eyes. And for the first time since they met, he saw her without distance. No boardroom armor. No hidden layers. Just exhaustion, honesty, and something fragile trying to exist between them without collapsing. What happens now? He asked quietly. Eleanor looked toward the fields behind him, sunlight finally breaking fully through the clouds and spilling gold across the wheat like something forgiven. Now, she said, we fix what should have never been broken. Behind them, the board members stood silently, no longer arguing. Clara leaned slightly into Ethan's side, still holding his hand. And for the first time in a long time, the farmhouse did not feel like it was waiting for something to end. It felt like something had just begun, though none of them yet knew what it would cost to keep it. The sun rose gently over Hollow Creek the next morning, not with brilliance, but with a soft, forgiving light that spilled across the wheat fields like a quiet apology for everything the storm had taken the night before. Dew still clung to the wooden porch of the Brooks farmhouse, catching gold in every bead of moisture as if the land itself had decided to breathe again. The black SUVs were gone. The gravel driveway was empty except for tire marks fading slowly into the earth. Inside the house, silence no longer felt heavy. It felt lived in. Ethan stood in the kitchen by the window, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding a coffee mug he had forgotten to drink. Clara sat at the table, drawing something carefully in her notebook, her pencil moving slower than usual, as if she understood the importance of the quiet around her. Eleanor stood near the doorway with her jacket folded over her arm, not rushing, not leaving yet either. There was no board meeting waiting in the distance now. No voices pressing in. Just the slow settling of something that had been too loud for too long finally coming to rest. Ethan finally broke the silence. "So that is it?" he asked softly. Eleanor turned slightly toward him. "No," she said gently. "That was just the noise." Clara looked up. "Noise?" Eleanor nodded once. "All the things that make people forget what matters." Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back against the counter. "And what matters?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before answering. "This place does." The words were simple, but they stayed in the air longer than expected. Outside, a light breeze moved through the wheat fields, bending them in slow waves under the morning sun. Roy Mercer's truck could be seen parked near the fence line, the old man sitting on the hood drinking coffee without speaking, just watching the land like he had done for most of his life. He had not come inside. He did not need to. Clara stood from the table suddenly and walked over to Eleanor, holding out her drawing. It was a sketch of the farmhouse, uneven but full of care. "This is us," she said. Eleanor took it carefully, like it mattered more than anything she had held in weeks. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Clara shrugged. "It is not perfect." Ethan smiled faintly without meaning to. "That is how you know it is ours." Eleanor looked at Ethan then, something softer settling in her expression. "I think I forgot what imperfect can feel like when it is safe." Ethan nodded slowly. "It usually takes time to remember that." There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. Then Eleanor set her jacket down on the chair and walked slowly toward the back door. Ethan followed after a moment, and Clara trailed behind them both as if afraid the world might shift again if she was not there to witness it. They stepped outside together into the morning air. The fields stretched endlessly ahead, glowing in warm gold under a clear sky that had finally stopped threatening rain. The wind was calm now. Not gone. Just gentle. Eleanor stood at the edge of the porch looking out at the land. "It is strange," she said quietly. "What is?" Ethan asked. "How something so large can feel quiet when it is finally honest." Ethan looked over the fields too. "That is because it does not have to prove anything anymore." Eleanor nodded slightly, absorbing that. Clara ran down the porch steps and stopped in the grass, spinning once with her arms open like she was testing whether the air had changed too. "It feels different today," she called out. Ethan and Eleanor both watched her. Ethan answered softly, "It does." Eleanor turned toward him again, her voice lower now. "What happens now?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Not like a man solving a problem. Like someone deciding how to live inside an answer. "We keep fixing things," he said at last. "Machines. Fields. Whatever breaks." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And people." Ethan met her eyes. "Especially people." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor stepped closer to the edge of the porch where he stood. There was no hesitation now. No distance pretending to be protection. Just two people standing in the same morning light that had once felt impossible to reach. "I am not good at staying in one place," she admitted quietly. Ethan nodded. "Neither am I." That made her smile more fully this time, small but real. "Then maybe we are both bad at running." Ethan gave a soft laugh. "That sounds like trouble." "Probably." Clara called out from the field. "Can I name the barn cat now?" Ethan raised his voice slightly. "We do not have a barn cat." Clara pointed proudly. "We do now." Eleanor looked toward her and then back at Ethan. "She is persistent. She gets that from both of us," Ethan said before realizing he said it. The sentence hung there for a moment. Not heavy, just honest. Eleanor looked down briefly, then nodded. "That is probably true." A quiet breeze moved through the yard, carrying the scent of fresh earth and distant rain that no longer threatened. Ethan stepped down from the porch and picked up a small wrench lying on the railing, turning it in his hand before placing it back into his pocket. It was such a small motion, but it felt like a decision. Eleanor watched him do it. "You are going back to work today?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Something will break." She smiled. "It usually does." They stood there a moment longer in silence that no longer felt like absence. Then Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She hesitated before handing it to him. Ethan unfolded it slowly. It was a simple handwritten note. Not a contract. Not a directive. Just numbers, a location, and one line at the bottom that said, "In case something needs fixing again." Ethan looked up at her. "Is this your way of staying?" Eleanor shook her head slightly. "It is my way of not disappearing completely." Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "That works." Clara ran back toward them and grabbed both of their hands without asking, pulling them toward the field like the day was too good to stand still in one place. And for the first time in a long time, nobody stopped her. The farmhouse behind them sat quietly under the morning sun, not as something ending, but as something finally beginning to feel like home again. And in that stillness, nothing was perfect, but everything was real. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts and follow for more quiet moments like this. Thank you for being here.